Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to be covering different frame rate tests in 6 different games in 30, 40, 50, and 60 FPS. I'm making this video because I was having a debate with a friend of mine over technology and the rather by now ancient discussion of frame rates and what you need to actually play a game consistently and reasonably, lag-free. A lot of claims were made, claims I've heard many times at this point, such as that the human eye can't see past 30 FPS, that there is no difference between 30 FPS and 60 FPS, and that it's all a lie made up by the PC master race. Oh joy. 2. Methodology and test bench. So my test bench for today is a Ryzen 5 1600X with CL16 Corsair Vengeance LPX memory at 2666 MHz and an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti on an ASRock B350 gaming K4 platform. The Ryzen 5 1600X is overclocked to 4.025 GHz at 1.4 volts. The NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti has a plus 77 MHz core overclock and a negative 400 overclock to the memory. I used CRU, Custom Resolution Utility, to create a custom refresh rate and lock my monitor to 30, 40, 50, and 60 FPS. Using in-game VSync to keep those frame rates stable and consistent. My recording software is OBS. Because of the effect of recording lower frame rates with higher FPS capture has on footage, all footage was captured at the frame rate the game played at. Double checked for consistency. I'll be doing 5 different tests: Unity in Heaven, Battlefield 4, PUBG, Subnautica, and For Honor, all in 30, 40, 50, and 60 FPS. 2 evaluations will be done. 1 for the visual fidelity, and 2 for the gameplay aspects. 3. The results. I will be covering 30 FPS primarily and giving very basic details of how the frame rates performed from 40 to 50 to 60. More isn't required here, as 30 provides the baseline, and the next most important being 40. 50 and 60 were far less noticeable all around. Moving on to the actual results. Battlefield 4 and PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds had the worst results. 30 FPS was not a viable option for either one of those. It wasn't viable for competitive play. Given the increased input lag of 30 FPS from 60 FPS, every action felt really slow and unresponsive. It was incredibly hard to aim, and I couldn't get any consistency on tracking and aiming between targets because the input lag just put too much stress on the game itself, I guess. It was untenable. Any game based on the premise of competition between 2 people or a team of people versus another team of people, 30 FPS is untenable, and it'll hold you back. This is more acceptable in single player and standalone games. Anything involving team play, I didn't personally feel comfortable playing at all at. Not with those frame rates, and I felt like far more of a burden than any kind of a boon. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds was done in solo play for this reason. Graphically, it was very noticeable, with objects looking like they were skipping frames or stuttering the entire time. When I say noticeable, I mean my eyes spent a good deal of time trying to track all the juddery or stuttering frames instead of spending what time that took looking for enemies and capture points or gear or loot in the case of PUBG. For Honor suffered the same input lag. All games tested at 30 FPS had the same deal. In For Honor, there are not as many inputs as Battlefield 4. Everything was slow and unresponsive, but it didn't suffer the same amount or the same kind of issues. Battlefield 4 and PUBG had a lot of tracking issues with the camera. It was hard to see. Nothing was smooth. Moving your camera back and forth. It was an incredibly not fun experience, and it was hard to aim in general. Graphically, it was very noticeable with stuttering frames and a lack of smoothness. From character models to NPC models to how buildings would look very blurred and etc. It obviously skipped, just like you're going to hear me say 1,000 times. 30 FPS skips on everything. It doesn't matter the game. I still found myself not being able to dodge, react, and attack without having to compensate for additional lag, and this is still very untenable, and in general felt very poor. C. Subnautica. Subnautica was interesting. There's no competitive aspect as it's a standalone survival game, so it inherently revolves around user experience almost completely. 30 FPS in Subnautica was still not fun, but it was still somewhat playable. Graphically, it was very noticeable with the stuttering frames and the objects looking like they were stuttering all the time. One aspect of Subnautica, when you're accessing their version of a storage chest, or in this case a locker, there's an animation that goes between your inventory and your locker. When you open and shut your locker, you can see the frames that are stuttering in between. There's no smoothness, and this physically hurt my eyes. A major downside of 30 FPS. I should state more here that Subnautica is a game that has very, very impressive visuals, and 30 FPS really subtracted from the experience. In this case, it was very obviously a case of the smoother it is, the better it will play, the better it will look, etc. Unigine Heaven. I included Unigine Heaven because it has no inputs. It's a benchmark on Rails, and it has no variation. Requires no inputs, and it's 100% consistent in how it plays out. It's entirely based on how it performs visually. It is difficult to not use hyperbole when talking about 30 FPS because it feels and looks like crap. There's a noticeable decline in the smoothness and a noticeable uptick in the stutteringness of 30 FPS from 40 or 50 or 60. This is only an aesthetics thing, but there were only aesthetics to judge it by. It looked very different, and it was definitely less consistent and more poor from frame to frame. Without question, it's noticeable. Even cherry-picking the best footage with the least stuttering, it was still very noticeable. Moving on. 40 FPS. PUBG and BF and Battlefield 4, 40 FPS, it was a lot like 30 FPS, but the stuttering was a bit less. There was less input lag, and pretty much it was still the same as 30 FPS graphically, but it wasn't as bad. It's not good enough for team play. It might be a fairly decent experience in single player, maybe. But in 40 FPS, you're going to consistently hold your team back because of the input lag, because of how it looks, because you can't tell all of what's going on screen, and then there's so much you have to keep track of. Any lack of smoothness or any stuttering is a major problem, and it will hamper both your gameplay and your team. PUBG was the same thing. I would not play squad in that, and squad is my favorite mode. In 40 FPS solo, PUBG was still bad. I don't know what to say. It was still very bad. I felt like I got held back majorly, and this is a game where you have one life, and every single thing you do matters. Every action, every time you look, it is very, very important to be able to look around your camera and look around the world and not have any issues with this. For Honor had input lag and graphical issues, but they weren't as bad as 30. It had less of an impact. It still has an inherent nature of competitive play. That means more FPS equals better. Inherent overall gameplay and functionality. The visual aspects were... Subnautica played a lot better at 40 FPS. It was a lot easier to move my camera around, and the graphical stuttering was not nearly as bad. If I had to compare it to something, the input lag seemed a lot like For Honor. It wasn't as laggy. I didn't have as much of a problem moving from place to place, but it still feels like moving your character with concrete blocks on their feet. It very rigid. It's like driving a car that doesn't steer well. But as it's single player, it technically has less of an experience. Technically has less of an impact on the game because there's no competitive aspect, because there's not really any objective reason other than making the game harder for yourself and your experience less good. Basically, it's the same thing as 30 FPS, just not as bad. 50 FPS. 50 FPS was the tipping point for PUBG and Battlefield 4. While there was still a good deal of input lag and still some graphical stuttering, for the most part, it became somewhat fairly smooth, and input lag felt okay. I felt more comfortable playing in Conquest or Team Deathmatch or anything that relies on me to interact with my team to capture objectives or get kills or do anything of that nature. The extra input lag and aim lag is still going to get you killed. It's not good enough. You're still going to be bothered by how the game looks at that point, unless you're extremely used to it, and I don't know why you would be. For Honor, it started playing a lot better with 50 FPS because there aren't as many inputs, because it's the battlefield there is more static and there's less actual interaction. You might have, let's say 100 inputs a minute versus Battlefield 4 at like 500. It became really obvious to me that even during the initial testing, games that require more inputs or constant inputs would suffer a lot more than games that don't. For Honor is a good example of that. However, it's still a competitive game, so it still had an impact. But 50 FPS seemed to very much be the tipping point between how things went. Subnautica being one of the lesser impacted games with less than 60 FPS, it felt really smooth at 50, and it was easier to become immersive in the world. It's still not good enough. Unity haven't started scaling well visually at around 50 FPS. What you could tell before at 30 and 40 FPS becomes a lot harder to tell now. While most stuttering is not apparent, a little bit still is, and it's not good enough. 60 FPS. 60 FPS is a little beyond the tipping point for PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds and Battlefield 4, where it becomes much more smooth and much more consistent. The input lag is still measurable, but it's not 30 FPS. You can still feel the stutters, and you can still feel a little bit of the input lag if you tried higher frame rates at all. You can definitely still feel it. But moving to 60 FPS from 30 is the difference between night and day for smoothness and input lag, honestly. I felt more comfortable playing in a team environment in both PUBG and Battlefield 4 at 60 FPS. I didn't have any reservations about doing it. It was good enough. For Honor felt completely smooth. Then any input lag there was, it doesn't matter, even from a competitive standpoint. Even though more is better, you could easily just play on 60 FPS, and it would still be fine. Subnautica had more than reached its tipping point. It was pretty damn good at 60 FPS. I was completely happy with that experience. It was good. I had something happen with Unity Heaven. I'm not sure I buy the result. It still seemed like there was stuttering with the benchmark, even though it read 60 FPS the entire time. I'm not sure what it was, but I don't think it's a 60 FPS issue, given what I know about it from previous testing. So it's I wouldn't test it. Maybe it's just because it's taxing on hardware to record it like that. I'm not certain. Interpreting the results. Point blank, there's an obvious difference between 30 and 60 FPS. This has been a known thing for a long time now. There is no arguing that there is a difference. There is no arguing that there is a meaningful difference. This argument wasn't correct 10 years ago, and it isn't correct now. It's a bullshit argument, argued by people who don't know better and usually have some form of bias towards a subject. Competitive games should not be played at less than 60 FPS, especially team-based ones. Either get better hardware, lower your graphical settings, or lower your resolution. I would say a bare bones minimum of 50 FPS for general competitive games is good enough, with the reasonable minimum being 60. Anything less isn't good enough. This is why. It takes a tremendous amount of graphical horsepower to maintain a locked 60 FPS at max settings, even on my 1080 Ti. I would get rare, but still existent drops. This is for a graphics card that isn't bottlenecked much by my CPU and is designed for 3840 by 2160. 4 times the pixel density and 4 times the resolution. So if I'm still getting frame drops with that much power, you're going to get a lot more of it and a lot more inconsistency on lesser hardware. So overkilling it a little bit can drastically help. It could be the difference between 60 in one scene and 38 in another. Conclusion. I'm not sure what more there is to say. The results and data speak for themselves. It's as I said, and it's as I thought before I even went into this. This was never a real argument. Not in the million times before this video, or the million times after. To claim that there is no difference between 30 and 60 FPS is drastically, dramatically, empirically, graphically, competitively, and statistically untrue. It never has been, and it never will be. One interesting thing I found in this video is that different games react differently to different frame rates. That is to say, a game at 50 FPS might play better or the same as a game at 60 FPS, depending on the environment and the conditions present of the game itself. Example, Subnautica played better at 50 FPS than Battlefield 4 played at 60 FPS. This is because of a whole host of different factors and could probably make for a very interesting standalone video in its own right. And with that, I'm brought to the end of this video. This has been a very interesting video to put together. I feel that this really feels like a waste of my time, but I hope that someone can get some useful information out of this and maybe make a real informed opinion. I might make a follow-up video later, but for now, that's it. It's been Zorn. Later.